welcome at Twende Shule, the project that offers online teaching in various subjects. So in the previous lesson, we learned about the Great Economic Depression, specifically the causes of the Great Economic Depression. Therefore, today we are going to cover about the impact of the Great Economic Depression. The impact of the Great Economic Depression, or the consequences, or the outcome, or the aftermath of the Great Economic Depression. Therefore, the Great Economic Depression, as I said, it was a long period of economic downturn. It was a long period of economic slumber. So the production rate declined drastically. People suffered a lot. So now let us see how people suffered and what were other outcomes that resulted from the Great Economic Depression. So we may start with the impact of the Great Economic Depression generally, then we will come specifically to African continent as the case study. Therefore, let us start from the impact of the Great Economic Depression in general. First, it led to the increase of unemployment rate. It led to the increase of unemployment rate. During the boom time, the employment rate was at a very high rate. People were employed. Those educated and non-educated were employed. But after the Great Economic Depression, there were no employment. The industries were unable to employ people. Financial institutions like banks were unable to employ people because they are suffering from economic malnutrition. Even those who were employed at that time, they were chased away from the work. Redundancy of workers was common. Therefore, for instance, in USA, unemployment rate stood at 25%. Up to 1933. So you may imagine 25% of the US population was unemployed, whereby it is approximated that it is more than 12 million people were unemployed in the USA. Therefore, another impact of the Great Economic Depression, many people were starved. Starvation occurred. Remember, for instance, in USA, during 1932-1933, out of the Great Economic Depression, it also occurred the so-called drought. So agricultural production were dropped drastically. People had no food. Even the food that was available, people had no money to buy the food that was available. The price of food stood very drastically. It rose very drastically. So people become jobless. Remember, people had no job. They had no money to purchase food. Either they had a family, maybe you are living with the 5 children and a wife. You are chased away from your work. You have no money to buy food. People starved. Millions of people were starved. People had no food. First, because the agricultural activity declined, but also even the available food was not enough to feed the whole population. And even there is food, people had no money to buy food. My friend, it was a very worst situation. Another impact of the Great Economic Depression, many people became homeless. Many people became homeless. Specifically those who are living in urban, in cities, as tenants. The landlords chased them away because they had no money to pay for the rent. People became homeless. Now they started to be congregated in a special camp. Others become vagrant in the street. Those who depended on living on somebody's house by paying rents, they had no money to pay. So the landlord Without humility and hospitality, they chased them away. Then the people became homeless, moving here and there with a bag of clothes, have no place to settle, have no place to sleep. It was a very worst situation. Another impact of the Great Economic Depression was the reduction of wages. Due to the unemployment rate, the few who survived to work, their wages were reduced. Maybe, for instance, in USA, it seems sometime to other workers, their wages were reduced at a half. Maybe you are paid 1 million and now you'll be given 500,000. Try to imagine, we are used a budget of 1 million per month. Then maybe you are working in a certain industry, then the industrial owner comes and says, from today, you are going to receive only 500,000. You cannot refuse it because you have no way out. You have nowhere to go. You must work it, though your wages have reduced. So people suffered from the reduction of wages. Remember, there is unemployment. You refuse today, you say, I will not work with you because you have reduced my salary. Tomorrow, somebody will come to work for it. So you have to tolerate. The situation was worse. Another impact of the Great Economic Depression was the fall in industrial production. As I said, that agricultural activity declined. And during that time, most of the industry depended on the raw material from the farm. Specifically, textile industries, they depended much the raw material from farm, either cotton or sisal or wool from sheep. So due to the decline of agriculture, the industrial production fell down. Not only that, remember there were flooding of goods in the market, but there were no consumers. So you cannot produce more while you know that in the market there is flooding of goods and there is no consumers, because the purchasing power of people declined. So the industrial owners had to reduce the extent of production, had to reduce how they are producing. Maybe you are producing 1,000 tons per year. You have at least reduced maybe to 200 tons per year. Because even when you produce more, there is no market. The situation was worse. Another impact of the Great Economic Depression was closing down of the financial institution. Closing down of the financial institution. Remember, when we were discussing about the causes of the Great Economic Depression, we discussed about the failure of speculators to return loans from the financial institution. So the financial institution, including banks and insurance companies, they suffered from economic malnutrition. They were unable to run themselves. They were unable to lend loans from other people. So most of the financial institutions were closed. For instance, in USA, from 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into power, he announced for 5 days at the banking holiday. Then they enacted the Banking Emergency Act, whereby they allowed the government officials to investigate if the financial institutions like banks were sound to operate. And those banks which were not sound to operate, they were closed. And according to the data, it seems almost 1/3 of the bank in USA were closed because they are not financially sound. So most of the banking or financial institutions were closed down until when it was proved beyond the reasonable doubt that they were able